First of all, welcome back from lunch, everyone. And I'm really honored and excited to connect you all with Sean Flynn, who is with the Rental Housing Association of Washington. This is going to be a really great presentation about local and legislative issues that are currently going on, and some that are just current in general. And so I'm going to hand it over to Sean. Sean, thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today. I think probably best, fair warning, I'm under the weather, so my trusted right hand, Daniel Bannon, will be running most of this presentation for you. I'm really here as close in legal ground support. And what we'll do is we'll hold questions till the end because the slides are pretty detailed. I know what happens a lot of times in these procedures is I get hypotheticals that are very specific. Like, let's say you had a voucher holder living at a specific building, right, that aren't really hypotheticals. So I will tell you that we are giving general best practice advice today. In no way does this establish a attorney-client relationship. And what we're giving you is industry best practice advice and ways that you can sort your affairs. Mr. Bannon, with that, I'll hand it off to you and you can start moving through the slides and I'll jump in when needed.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Bannon. I'm the grassroots organizer, membership engagement coordinator for the Rental Housing Association of Washington. I was deeply involved in all of our legislative efforts, as well as continuing to educate and update our members when there are any changes in rental housing policy that they need to be aware of. So, we're going to go over all of the new state laws, as well as dig into the nuance of the local jurisdictions differences as far as specifically Tacoma, but also a brief overview of some other cities as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. Okay. Perfect. So this first slide just covers generally what the Rental Housing Association is. We're a trade org that represents small housing providers in the entire state. And we make sure that people are properly educated on how to follow rental housing policy, but also ensuring that we provide them with the best resources in order to do so. So we have industry-leading forms. All of our forms are attorney reviewed, compliant with any recent changes in rental housing policy. And our turnaround time with updating those forms and ensuring everything is accurate is pretty impressive, if I do say so myself. We're usually able to turn things around before the law changes actually go into effect. And in situations where the law changes go into effect rapidly, such as the rent stabilization, rent control bill, where it took effect immediately when signed, we were able to turn that around in just about 24 hours so that all of our forms were updated because there was mandatory language that had to be included in that bill as far as when you provide a rent increase, there was mandatory language. The next slide, we already did our introductions, but I'm joined today by Sean Flynn. Sean Flynn is the executive director and board president of the Rental Housing Association of Washington, and he will be helping me out if there are any more technical slides or questions, which there definitely are a couple that get a little bit complicated, but I think with our explanation, it should be not too difficult for everybody to get a good idea of what we've got going on. What are our goals for today? I think the first main goal is to understand what changes have been made in this last legislative session, which ended quite a few months ago now, but some of these policies just went into effect during the summertime. I also think it's incredibly important for housing providers to understand the nuance and the difference in the variations of rental housing policy that occur or are present in all the different jurisdictions. Especially when there's certain policies that are the same policy, but they have different details. I think one of the best examples of this is notice period. Oftentimes in local jurisdictions, there's going to be notice periods that are the same number of days, but the way that you're required to abide by each number of days is slightly different across all of King County and Washington State. Tacoma specifically has one of the most complicated procedures as far as how to serve rent increase notices, where there are multiple time windows where you have like a 60-day window that you have to serve the rent increase, and then you have to serve another one within a different 60-day window in order to
We have
make
a,
sure it's fully
we have a,
compliant.
we have a slide on that. Keep moving.
Yeah, I'm just giving the intro shot.
Okay,
He's
go
going to
ahead.
do this throughout the rest of the presentation. But I'll keep it pushing.
I have a cold. I'm cranky.
Our first topic we're going to cover is the new state laws. General overview of the most significant two are HB 1003 and 1217. 1003 is the modification to notice service bills. So the part of this bill that makes our lives a little bit easier is that notices can now be mailed from a different county that they are going to be arriving in. Before this bill passed, notices had to be mailed in the same county that they were going to be received in. That is no longer the case, but this bill also added additional provisions where mailing of notice has to be certified mail now, as well as you need to allow an additional 5 days for the sending process. So with a lot of notices that are, say, like a 60-day notice, those will often have to have a slightly extended timeline to 65 days in order to be compliant with this. And then the rent control bill, also known as rent stabilization, affects both residential and manufactured housing, but the manufactured housing provisions are significantly more restrictive. All notices have to be 90 days for residential. Rent increases are limited to 7% plus CPI, which that CPI number is going to be provided to us by the state. And there is also no allowance for any change in terms for a term lease versus a month-to-month lease. And then as you can see in the bottom right hand of this slide, for manufactured housing, move-in and deposit fees are capped at 1 month's rent, or two if there are pets in the unit. And late fees are limited on a sliding scale. If they're late 1 month, it's 2%. You're allowed to charge up to 2% for that late fee. If they are late a second consecutive month, it's going to be up to 3% for that late fee. And for a third consecutive month or any additional, it's going to be capped at 5%. But we'll dig into a little bit more of the details of that as we go along. Senate Bill 5313 was also passed in this most recent legislative session. All of the RHA leases do not include any of these provisions and did not include any of these provisions, but I think it's important to note on this slide, the three clauses that are cited, those are not allowed to be included after this policy was passed. So I think it's great to take a second, read through those, ensure that if you do have any of these provisions in your lease, you remove them. Moving on. Most of, or all of the policies that we're going to discuss today are already in effect. That's why we're
Danny,
talking
there
about
was a
them.
question in the chat on what jurisdictions these laws cover.
This is all statewide policy right now. So we'll get into more details as far as local policies in probably about an hour. But all of the things I'm going to talk about until we get to the section that says local laws are going to be statewide. And you are only exempted from specifically the rent control 1217 bill if you are an affordable housing entity, government subsidized, or what's the exact terminology, Sean?
Certain government subsidized tenancies, and if this relates to the building, are exempt from 1217, but not all.
I'm just checking the chat to see if there's any more questions.
Keep going. You just keep working. I'll work the chat.
You'll watch questions?
You're doing
Sounds
great,
good.
Daniel. You're doing great.
Thanks, Sean. So yeah, all of these policies are already in effect. I spoke a little bit to the efficiency at which RHA is able to implement these changes. We are very quick with it, and I encourage everybody to make sure that you are in compliance with all of these laws as they are currently the law of the land. So let's dig into exactly what the 7% plus CPI cap means. So the Department of Commerce has been tasked with calculating and publishing what their understanding of the CPI is. CPI is Consumer Price Index, for those of you who don't already know. And the specific CPI that they're going to be looking at in order to determine the Washington State rent cap is going to be based on City of Seattle and published by the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics. And even though there is a 7% plus CPI allowance, that is hard capped at 10%. So if the CPI, for example, is 3.5%, as they calculated it to be for the remainder of 2025, that will just be 10% rent cap flat. Whereas next year, I believe they've calculated the CPI to be about 2.6%. So next year it's going to be around 9.6. Oh, it's right here. 9.8 or 9.6883%. I don't know why that tripped me up a little bit. But it's very important to make sure that your cap is under this limit, because there's provisions later that we'll discuss that enables the tenant and the attorney general to take action against you if you do serve an improper rent increase. I like to recommend, instead of going all the way up to the cap, go a couple points of a percentage point under the cap, like 9.9, 9.8, just so you're making sure that there's no miscalculations that could cause you to accidentally be over that 10%, or for 2026, that 9.6% cap. But also RHA provides this information to our membership, and I believe some of our blog posts are also accessible outside of our membership, which we post this information on our blog to keep people informed. But you should be able to just go to the Landlord Resource Center that's mentioned on this first bullet point, and they will provide you with similar information to what the Rental Housing Association provides as far as specifically just the rent increase cap. This was what I mentioned earlier in the overview of 1217. There are no alternate terms or incentives allowed for a different length of the lease. So you can't advertise a lease that's a year lease. And then if somebody asks, hey, I want this, I would like to rent this unit, but I would like to be month to month, you're not allowed to then offer them a month-to-month lease at a higher rental rate than what was advertised, other than a 5% difference in the amount of monthly rent. So make sure that, I think a best practice in this scenario is just to keep the terms exactly the same other than the lease term. If you're going to be offering somebody different terms than what you're advertising, I think a better best practice, Sean, go ahead.
Well, I mean, what we're seeing from our membership is they're just not offering different lease terms.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. I think
in a not unforeseeable event stemming from this law, where it's often commonplace for housing providers to say, hey, if you want a 6-month lease, it's this much. If you want a year's lease, it's this much. If you want a 2 years lease, it's this much. If you want a month to month, it's this much, right? Now there's a 5%. You can't deviate from a 5% delta between any of your lease offerings. So what we're seeing is that we offer one option. It's a year, or it's a year, whatever the option the landlord's going to do, that's what they move towards. This has been particularly difficult for the student population, who are often looking for leases that are more flexible around their school year. And this has really pushed housing providers into a corner and has subsequently hurt the residents. But it is what it is, and that's really unfortunate. Keep going, Daniel.
Yeah, and like Sean mentioned, a best practice in this scenario is just to offer the term that you're offering and do not make any exceptions for anybody asking for any sort of different terms or anything like that, because that could get you into hot water. And having a good understanding of what you're offering, and not getting into the weeds about the details as far as changing anything with what you're offering, that will keep you from making any mistakes.
Mr. Bannon, would this affect something like a move-in discount or certain incentives that you're getting people to fill vacant units?
Yeah, it could. I think that offering incentives for different terms is generally a bad idea after this. Because again, like that's what we were speaking to earlier, as far as if you're changing exactly what you're offering and you've figured out that what you're offering is compliant in the first place, if you make any changes to that, that puts you in this uncertain zone of negotiation where it's a lot easier to make a mistake with exceptions than it is to just set a hard rule, no exceptions, and know that you're in compliance with the law.
And how is this working out in combination with the rent cap? Let's say I've got a unit coming available in January. Are a lot of our members reducing their price dramatically to get it filled?
Not as many as previous years because
Right, because the way this works out in practice with the rent cap is what people used to do is they'd offer incentives to get the unit filled, right? And then when the market was normal again, because the market's always depressed in January, the rent would raise back up to that level over a longer term lease. That's not happening anymore. Yeah. And so effectively what this law has done is that it makes it very difficult to find a deal or a sale on a unit. But again, it's unfortunate, but you know,
and
the
and that's
legislature
also
the legislature has spoken, and so here we are.
And that's because of something that we didn't dig into specifically earlier, but it was mentioned on the slides. The no rent increases within the first 12 months of tenancy is part of the 1217 rent control policy. So if you were to get somebody in the off season, as you would say, like January, then they're locked in at that rental rate for at least 18 months in the city of Seattle, for example, because you would have to wait for 12 months and then serve them the 6 month notice and then wait another 6 months for that to take effect.
We have a question from the group saying, even though I asked questions to be done at the end, but keep the questions coming. This is great. It's free flow. What about companies that are using a pricing system that changes the pricing every day depending on the market? Daniel, has there been any recent legislation on this topic?
So there are multiple jurisdictions now, specifically Seattle and King County, but likely coming to Spokane soon, that actually ban the use of those sorts of programs at all. So RHA's members don't use any sort of rent pricing algorithms to price their units, but a lot of larger entities do. Our official recommendation is to not use those services at all.
Because that is to answer the question is the specific question, which is now gone, and I don't know why it drops off the chat, is that if you're using something like that, there hasn't been a case brought yet, but you could be likely in violation of 1217. And likely there'll be regulation going forward. And from the state level, there was the ordinance was introduced last year that didn't make it through. But now we're seeing local municipalities ban those programs altogether. There's been several lawsuits brought by attorney generals across the country against these main players in this space, some of which were just settled for large sums of money. So if you're going to use a rent pricing algorithm, I would talk to your attorneys at great length about what kind of exposure you have in using that.
And then we also have another question in the chat about evictions occurring during blackout times, during evictions like the school year ban or the winter eviction ban. That's something we're going to cover later in the presentation. So I think we'll just go ahead and wait.
Keep moving on the slides. I'll keep
Yeah.
working the questions. Keep going.
All right, this is going back to policies related to HB 1003, the certified notice bill. I mentioned earlier, that you need to include an additional 5 days for mailing of your notice if you are mailing your notice. And that is in addition to the already pre-existing 1 day allowance for service of a notice. So it's essentially 6 days that you need to add in addition to the actual specific timeline of the notice itself. We were just talking about on the last slide, no increases are permitted within the first 12 months of tenancy. And then you are only allowed to provide one rent increase per 12-month period. So basically one rent increase per year. A lot of local jurisdictions already have policies that make it so that it's not really realistic to serve more than one rent increase in a year. But just something to keep in mind. And then, as I was mentioning, more so the beginning of this presentation, a lot of local jurisdictions have their own policies that layer on top of these state level policies that require you to serve a notice well in advance of the 90-day notice that is now statewide policy. So make sure to be double checking. We'll be going into exactly what some of those look like, but make sure you're double checking with your local jurisdiction exactly what that process looks like. In City of Tacoma specifically, it is much more complicated than nearly anywhere else in the rest of the state. We have some model questions here as well. What if I have a term lease ending 60 days from now and I need to increase the rent? So you would need to serve the rent increase within the proper timeline, but it would not take effect during the current lease term. It would take effect offset with your lease terms. I think there's an understanding or a misunderstanding by a lot of housing providers that rent increases or any sort of notice has to be in conjunction with lease renewals. And that is not the case. You are allowed to, if you serve a notice and it takes effect 2 months into a new lease term, that is perfectly fine. But make sure that you're not serving multiple increases within that 12-month period. And then also always make sure that a lease term longer than 12 months is notarized. And this last point about making sure that you're following the most strict version of the law. Typically, city laws are going to be more restrictive than state law as far as when they're getting into the details and being incredibly specific. So make sure you're following the most detailed, most specific version. Oh, and then Amanda is asking about not increasing rent for 18 months.
I got it. Keep going.
Yeah. You could serve it in a way that it would take effect at the end of
Keep-
that
keep
12-month period.
Keep
Okay.
moving on the
Just
thing.
gonna type it.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay. Moving on to preparing the notice. So this one gets a little technical as far as the specific language that we recommend as a best practice. So all of our forms have been updated, as I mentioned earlier, as I've mentioned a couple times already. But if you use your own forms, make sure you are including the language that has been provided from the state specifically. So that's what I was talking about, where we had to update something within just 24 hours in order to make sure it was compliant. The state has now given us model language, which it's a little bit blurry on my slide, but you'll see your landlord blank intends to do one of the following, and that has a bunch of check boxes, and then it has this whole section about exemptions. That's all required language by the state in any rent increase, and that details out exactly how much the rent increase is going to be. And if you are increasing the rent over the cap because you are an exempt group, you are able to select that in the checkboxes below. But regardless if you are exempt or not, this is the language that you have to include in any rent increase notice. And then the second bullet point can be a little bit confusing to people if this is the first time you've heard somebody talk about this. You need to prepare a separate copy for each of your residents, as well as one additional copy that is addressed to all other occupants. This is because there are sometimes situations where there is somebody who is not authorized that is living in your unit, but that individual could still be considered a tenant, and that individual still needs to receive proper notice for any changes in the lease terms or rent increases, even though they are not technically an authorized resident. And digging into that a little bit more.
One more slide.
Oh, we also have a full notice
I have a
service
whole slide
instructions
on
and yeah. But I just want to mention before we move on, we also have a full notice service instructions with declaration of service available in our forms library. Members find that very helpful. This is what I was talking about. I recommend, as far as serving any notice, to try to organize a time where you can meet with your tenants and provide them with in-person service and then document the time, the date when you did so. Because then that avoids having to do the mailing process anyway. But if it just isn't possible to meet in person with the tenants and hand each resident their own copy of the notice, which that is the required process to be able to serve proper notice, then you are going to post a copy on the door. Once again, a copy for each resident with their name on it and an additional copy for all other occupants. And then you are going to mail each of those notices separately, in addition to posting them on the door via USPS certified mail. So if you have 2 residents, you're going to post 3 copies on the door conspicuously. So make sure they're not folded or covered or anything like that. You're going to post them just as they are on the door.
face out.
And face out. Thank you. And then you're going to mail the same 3 additional copies via certified mail, because there's 1 copy for 1 resident, 1 copy for another resident, and 1 copy for all additional occupants.
Daniel, do I have to do this for just like pay or vacate notices?
This is for all rent increases, all substantial changes in lease terms. So any renewals, yeah, any substantial changes in lease terms, rent increases, anything like that. And this next slide is going to cover exactly what I was just talking about, but with some visuals. The slide gets a little bit complicated, but it does have a key in the bottom left-hand corner.
I'm moving through these question and answer periods. Man,
Yeah, you're killing it, Sean.
killing it today, even with a cold. I'm all hopped up on Sudafed. Let's go.
So I think that one of the main takeaways from this slide, because I kind of already went over the chart that we have, but in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see where service is required versus optional. Make sure that, I mean, you'll get a copy of these slides when we're done, but make sure that you are very specific on which kinds of notices you are required to do the entire process for, and which kinds of notices you are not necessarily required to do the whole process for. So I'll just let this one linger for a moment. Sean, did you have anything you wanted to add to
To
this
put it another
particular
way,
slide?
so the notices that this notice procedure applies to are what, Daniel?
Any abandoned property, any pay, comply, quit, or vacate notice, any end of term, any end of tenancy with clause, or rent increase, which I'll include that end of term also covers end of term plus renewal. So
So
if you're
so when I renew my leases, I now have to follow this procedure, right, Daniel?
yes.
What if I'm not raising the rent? I'm just going to go another year at the same rent. Do I still have to serve it this way?
Yes.
Oh, that seems cumbersome and expensive.
Yes. A lot of our members are finding the combination of the new notice requirements combined with the additional time periods to be frustrating and expensive. As you guys probably know, certified mail is more expensive than regular mail. And especially when you're required to serve multiple copies plus 1 additional copy for the theoretical resident. It can add up pretty quickly, especially if you're in charge of more than just a handful of units. Even for those who are in charge of just a handful of units, it can be pretty expensive. Somebody asked about they thought they had 30 days to send the security deposit back. When did it go back to 21 days?
I'm not even sure where that's coming from. Amanda, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I don't see that on the slide, but I will say that it is 30 days. It used to be 21 days, but it was changed to 30 days in 2023 or 2024. I don't remember exactly which
It
session it
didn't used to
was.
be 21 days either. It's that thing moves all over. It gets traded around in legislative land. Did
But
that
yeah,
answer?
you have 30 days.
Okay. We answered live. Next topic. Done.
I'm just making
Keep
sure
going,
we
bros.
got. Someone's asking, we've got a couple clarifying questions.
Yeah.
Second,
Keep moving through the slide, and we're not going to get through all this. So one notice has tenant one name only. The second notice will have tenant two name only. The third will address all other occupants. Correct.
yeah. I've sent the number of notices so far. Yeah, Stephanie makes a really good point. I've sent the proper number of notices certified, and the residents are not picking them up or signing the notices. Yes, this is the majority of the cases that we're hearing about now. Is the residents don't know or want to pick up certified mail. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. Hopefully, this policy gets fixed in the
Feel
upcoming
free to reach out to
2026
your elected
legislative session.
officials, and especially at the state level, and telling them what a ridiculous law this does and why it's a terrible idea.
Yeah, Paula
My
also
resident,
asks a great question, making sure she's understanding correctly. If we post to the door, it has to be facing outwards where anybody who walks by can see it. Yes,
yes, which is a
residents
great point,
also.
Paula, because I'm getting lots of complaints from residents saying, why are you treating me this way? And what I say is the Washington State Legislature is making me treat you this way. Because they feel like they're being like it's they've done something bad when I'm just giving them a lease renewal. It's
Um,
and it feels super invasive to their privacy. It's super unfortunate.
you can't print three notices with tenant number one and number two and all other occupants and just serve the three copies at the same time. Sean, what do
What?
you think about this? Like instead of having
You have to name the
individual.
tenant.
Yes, but if they have three copies and all three
Hmm.
copies have the same three names on them, is that
No,
fine?
no.
No?
You need to name each tenant. You need to give them each one, and then you've got to serve the extra one for all the occupants. The case law is real clear on this.
Okay. And then what do they do with certified mail notices that are returned?
The law only requires that you send it. It does not require that they pick it up. Once you've sent it certified mail and you have the thing, you sent it certified mail, you've complied with the law. This is the great sort of terrible, ironic portion of this law is that the idea is that you're communicating with your tenant, which is what we all used to do, right? Everyone communicated with the tenant that we wanted them to know their lease was being renewed, right? Now we have people not knowing because we comply with the law, and then lo and behold, no one gets the notice. But that's what you're obliged to comply with the law. You're not obliged to you can't go down there and like force them at gunpoint to go to the mailbox to the post office and get their certified mail. No one can, you can't do that. That's not, and nor is it your job. So, yep.
Okay, I'm going to keep the slides pushing, but we'll continue answering questions that we've got in the chat. This is all related to what we were just talking about. This says serve the end of term notice more than 60 days in advance. I would recommend 90 days because then your tenant has a decent amount of time to look at it and respond. They have, I believe it's 30 days to respond. And then your new lease will take effect 60 days from their response. Also serve rent increase more than 90 days, obviously, because we have to add an additional, oh, whoops, we have to add an additional 6 days for mailing. Yeah, this is all pretty much re-explaining what we've already gotten into. And the tip section is also recommending things that I think we've already covered. Explain the legal notice change to tenants. This is what we were just talking about, responding to some of the questions in the chat. Tenants are not happy with the process in which we are required to deliver them information or deliver them notice. So we recommend actually talking to your tenants and explaining to them, hey, this is just the process that I'm required to follow. These are the steps in the process I'm required to follow. Do not feel like you are being treated differently or being treated like you've done anything wrong. This is simply what I have to do in order to be compliant with the law.
We
Be
have
consistent.
we have an anonymous attendee asking, do I have to give them illegally a 60 days or 6-month notice of rent increase? It depends on where you are.
And
First and foremost, under the state law now, what's the number for rent increase, Rose?
90 days.
90 days. But if you're in a local jurisdiction that demands more, say Tacoma, because you guys have got a stair step deal there, you need to give them more. So for example, if you're in Seattle, Seattle's easy. It's 180 days notice for rent increase, right? So therefore, you want the larger number is going to be the one that holds. Let's go to the next slide.
Yep, and John asked a question that was already asked, but the notice does have to be placed conspicuously facing out on the door. It cannot be hidden in any way. We even recommend against folding the paper so that part of the notice is obscured. Do not do that. Make sure it is taped on the door, obviously. So that it is conspicuously is the language that the law uses. So this just goes over similar to what we were already talking about, but I think that the important thing to take away from these slides is that this process is complicated, but it is also very specific in the way that you are required to follow it. So if you're already understanding what I've been explaining in previous slides, this should start to make sense as far as what exactly you are serving to people and how you're doing it.
Betty is saying certified mailing is different than certified mail. That's right. And what's the law?
Certified mail. Patty. I see the Betty question about the
Betty Beer.
Yeah, I think Betty's offering a suggestion to how this law could be improved, which again, we recommend you contact your local representatives and provide your feedback to them.
Yeah, but the law currently is certified mail. Let's keep moving.
Yeah, I want to take a second to talk about City of Tacoma, though. City of Tacoma also has its own statutory language in addition to the Washington State statutory language. You have to serve both, and you have to serve both in conjunction with the time periods that are specific to City of Tacoma as well. So, like we were mentioning earlier, Tacoma is one of the most complicated rent increase notice jurisdictions in the entire state, if not the most complicated. Okay, moving on. Talking about how there is now a due date for when the tenant needs to comply or pay. The question is, does the due date need to include the 5 days for mailing? We always err on the side of caution with our best practices. So we believe that the answer is yes, but this is debated. But I recommend always following the best practices, the most strict interpretation of the law, because then it's not worth it to try to consider yourself as an exception or do the easier path and then get yourself in legal trouble. Being in legal trouble is terrible. Not that I would know from experience, but Sean could speak to knowing people that have been in legal trouble as his job as an attorney, and it is not fun and not financially worth it to save a little bit of time. Wow, we're getting a lot of questions in the chat. Sean, are you handling this?
Yeah, I'm trying. They're fast. Keep moving the slides. We're not going to get through
fast. We got plenty of time. Oh, sorry guys, skip forward a little bit. I mentioned a little bit of this earlier, but if you do, so this gets a little complicated. This is talking specifically about the 1217 if you were to violate the rent increase cap. The first onerous that's on the tenant in order to respond to this is they should give you a written opportunity demand to correct the rent increase if it is over the rent increase cap. From there, they are also allowed to terminate the agreement prior to the effective date by providing at least 20 days written notice. This is, again, this is if you violate the rent increase cap. The best way to not have to worry about this kind of stuff is by not violating the cap in the first place. But in a situation where you have mistakenly, I hope, provided a rent increase that is beyond what is allowed by the state, the tenant could break the lease after trying to ask you to fix it. And then they could also file a complaint to the Attorney General's office, which they file a complaint to the Attorney General's office. You also have to not agree to their demand to reduce the rent. But in that situation, you would likely be found in violation of state law. You would be required to pay out the damages of any excess rent, fees, other costs paid to you by the tenant, and a penalty of up to 3 months of the unlawful rent price. As well as the Attorney General can fine you up to $7,500 per violation. So for those of you who manage a lot of units, if you send out a round of incorrect rent increases and then you don't put in the effort to fix it with your residents, each one of those rent increases will be a $7,500 fine, in addition to all the other fines that are detailed above. And you're also not allowed to report them to any screening companies, but I think that that would be the least of your problems if you were found in violation of these policies. And this next chart is going to show how these mistakes can compound. So if you, this one gets a little complex and I might need Sean to jump in, but if you were to serve an incorrect rental amount and then continue charging the rent over the next couple of years, that whole period of time where they're, oh, you want to jump in,
So
Sean?
effectively, this is an example of like a small mistake that's not caught or corrected can have really bad consequences. So for example, let's say you send out a rent increase that you think is 7%, right? Sorry, that is an unlawful increase. What happens is it compounds. And if you go to the next slide, Daniel, we can see
And
what
keeps adding more details.
Yeah. Effectively, what ends up happening is if you go to evict that tenant, the state supplied attorney with your tax dollars will go through and demand every rent increase notice you've ever given. And if they find that one is over, you just don't owe the delta between what you should have increased and what you could have increased and what you did. It is then compounding with our example here. So here's an example of a small problem because you accidentally you have an unlawful rent increase compounding, and then you end up owing, you go in for an eviction, you end up owing $26,000 plus attorney's fees and costs. So I cannot tell you how important it is to make sure your increases are correct. And even if you think one might not be perfect, you need to fix it immediately because down the line, it can become real problematic.
And this is an example of just one unit. So we can extrapolate this out. If you have 10 units and you served all of them incorrectly, these damages are multiplied 10 times. So it is incredibly crucial to serve rent increases under the cap. And if there's any sort of mistake, fix it immediately, because you will not be happy if you are hit with these penalties. Next section, we're going to move on to the local laws. do we want to get through all of these questions before we move
No,
on to the local
I'm
law
trying to knock them
section?
out. Keep going, keep going.
Just want to keep going? All right. Okay. So this is the part that I've been looking forward to, as far as talking about the specificity in local jurisdictions. So there's a couple jurisdictions with required disclosures. Tacoma, again, has pretty significant required disclosures that you can see right there. All of these different cities have their own separate group of required disclosures, which is information that you must provide to the residents either in the lease packet or upon move-in. And these get updated pretty regularly, so make sure you have the most up-to-date version every year when you are providing this information to people. Once again, you can find this all on the RHAWA website if you are a member of ours. These are all of the cities who have their own move-in cost caps. Oftentimes, these take the form of security deposit and any non-refundable move-in fees being capped at the amount of first month's rent or 1 month's rent. Depending on the city that you're in, the phrasing is going to be slightly different. But oftentimes, you're not allowed to charge for more than 1 month's rent for a security deposit is the main idea. But with that, you should also be careful about charging any sort of non-refundable cleaning fee or anything like that upon move-in. Some housing providers, I think your opinion on this would be interesting as well, Sean. Some housing providers also subtract application fees from the 1 month's amount, but I don't think that all do.
Say that again.
As far as application fees, would you consider application fees to be a move-in cost?
It depends on the jurisdiction.
Okay. So yeah, some housing providers just as a best practice subtract it, some don't, but make sure to double check your local jurisdiction to see if that applies to you. Additionally, many jurisdictions require you to, or it might be statewide, to offer move-in costs in installments. But if the tenant requests that they pay their move-in costs in installments, you should offer them a plan. Yeah, and this is a state law, so you're allowed to do different installments depending on the lease terms. And of course, City of Tacoma has its own unique process as far as what the deposit payment or the move-in cost payment installments have to be. This is all the information we've already covered, plus the other layer on top of that. So each of these local jurisdictions have their own additional rent increase timelines, but they vary I mean, not dramatically, they vary subtly, but the differences, especially if you own property in multiple jurisdictions, gets really complicated because it sounds like the same policy, but it's different. That's what I was talking about kind of at the very beginning, where you'll notice that in several cities in King County and beyond, the standard is 120 days notice for any rent increase over 3%. But in Shoreline, it's 120 days for over 5%. Seattle, it's 180 days for any amount. And then Tacoma, this summary, the 210 to 180 plus 120 to 90 days, is not fully that's not a full explanation of what the process is like in Tacoma. And I think that we'll get into that more detailed in later slides. But you'll notice on the left side, when incentivizing a longer term lease, the only legal option is a rent discount up to 5%. Just don't do it. It's a bad idea to offer any sort of discount or exception because the odds of you making a mistake if you're making an exemption are so much higher than they would be if you just simply abide by what you've already put into policy and understood to be a correct policy. Okay. There are also late fee caps in various jurisdictions, but a lot of them are percentage based. Some of them are just a flat $10 cap. As you can see here, in the city of Tacoma, it is a $10 cap. And this is pretty self-explanatory. None of these, I will also elaborate, none of these are a sliding scale like the Washington State manufactured housing late fee cap. At the beginning, we talked about how if it's 1 month, it's 2%. If it's a second consecutive month, it's 3%, so on and so forth. None of the caps that you're looking at in front of you change depending on how many months consecutively the person is late. They're just a hard cap at 1.5 to 2% or $10 in all of these jurisdictions. Any properties that are not properly registered or have been deemed to be defective by an inspector are not allowed to provide any rent increases or end of tenancy notices. I believe that's pretty self-explanatory. For any, well, I mean, all cities in Washington State have some sort of just cause provisions, and just cause is a set of behaviors or actions that will then determine that somebody is allowed to be evicted or served with an end of term notice. They have to meet one of the criteria of I am committing this violation that is specifically detailed out in the Washington State law.
Yeah, or I mean, in fact, maybe maybe a more nuanced explanation is that these are the only ways you can terminate a tenancy in Washington State. So you can only terminate tenancies for an enumerated series of reasons. Some of those are tenant costs, and some of those are just maybe a landlord selling the property or someone's moving in. There's lots of different reasons for just cause, but they are enumerated in the law. So we have statewide just cause, and then we also have local just cause in the jurisdictions listed there, except for the ones that got scratched out there because the Rental Housing Association of Washington sued them and they had to repeal them. If you're interested in maintaining your property rights, make a donation to the Rental Housing Association of Washington's Legal Defense Fund. Continue, Danny.
Excellent, Sean. And some of the just causes as well are not just this violation occurred and that's a just cause. They're like the tenant was late on rent 4 or more months within a 12-month period. It's good to familiarize yourself with exactly what the language is on this, which again is on the RHA website. But if you're not an RHA member, you might have to do some research. Mandatory lease renewal is in the cities that are detailed here. Essentially, it means that you are not allowed to end a term lease with no cause at the end of a term. So this is one of the only areas of the law where City of Tacoma is actually not as restrictive than some of its counterpart cities in King County. But in all the cities that are listed, you are not allowed to end a term lease at the end of the term with no cause. You must provide a rent or a lease renewal at the end of the term. Yeah, we already went over notice period and everything like that, so I don't necessarily need to cover that again. Relocation assistance. So hopefully, again, this will not apply to you because this would also, relocation assistance is also under the assumption that you're providing a rent increase that is over a certain percentage, which in some places, in most places, except for City of Tacoma, that is actually beyond what the rent cap is. So that is no longer relevant in a lot of the cities. But in City of Tacoma, if your rent increase is over or equal to 5%, then and the tenant has to move due to economic hardship because of that rent increase, you could be required to pay them up to 3 times the monthly rental price in order to cover their relocation costs. And some cities, this is partially covered by the actual city and partially covered by the housing provider, but I believe in Tacoma it is 100% covered by the housing provider. And there's no means testing for this. You see the Tacoma, Bellingham, and Olympia. They can submit the request directly to the housing provider regardless of their income level. They do not have to prove that they are facing economic hardship due to the rent increase in order to claim the relocation assistance. So we've been going over the rent increase provisions a lot, but in City of Tacoma, your cap is effectively 5%. But don't do exactly 5% because that is also that will also trigger relocation assistance if the tenant moves. And we'll have quite a few questions to cover after we're done with our slides, which we've just got a couple more. Both Seattle and Tacoma have seasonal eviction bans, both school year and winter eviction bans. These just have specific periods of time that you are not allowed to serve anyone with an end of tenancy notice or evict them. And the school year ban applies to both employees of a school, not just students. Or I believe it also includes families with school-aged children that may not necessarily be in school. Is that accurate, Sean?
I'm sorry, what? I'm answering questions on the chat. What?
Oh yeah, we're doing double duty. Tacoma's school year eviction ban also covers families with school-aged children,
Correct.
even if they're not necessarily enrolled in school. I think. I would need to double check that one.
I think that most school-age children are enrolled. I think that maybe we might be doing a distinction without a difference.
Yeah, I was just thinking like homeschooled children might still
I think
be.
the language in the Tacoma ordinance is broad enough that that's going to get caught up.
Yeah, that's
Because
what
you
I thought.
homeschool your kid does, I don't think that's going to matter.
Mhm. Okay.
Super broadly defined. I mean,
Yeah.
we haven't had any case, like we haven't done a lot of appellate law on this, so it's not been interpreted robustly, but when in doubt, you're probably covered because it's very broad. The language is very broad.
It's always very broad. So what can you do in order to deal with these? Make sure to be following the law specifically and treat all tenants fairly. You can become an RHA member and help us communicate the impact of of these policies, especially if you're one of those people who's sending messages in the chat like, "Hey, this doesn't really make any sense." In a lot of situations, that is the case, and you can be part of our effort to try to communicate the consequences of the law to state and local lawmakers in order to hopefully reduce administrative and financial burden on housing providers. Participating in a chamber of commerce is also a great way to get involved with your local business community. And developing relationships with lawmakers is one of the more longer term things that you can do to be involved in this, but it's not necessarily super easy. But continuing to get yourself in front of lawmakers, establish yourself as a voice in your community, that can, over time, allow you to help communicate the change that you would like to see in law, and effectively advocate for your community. And as always, more housing supply will help reduce housing costs,